And we should be live. So welcome. The Lumix stream is still officially going, but it's going into all sorts of details and explanations about real-time LUT. So I thought let's start the stream and talk about the new Lumix G9 Mark II. And I've got a special guest, Rhett Thompson. He's gonna come on, and yeah, let's listen to what he has to say about this G9 Mark II. If you have any thoughts, leave them in the chat, interact with us, and I'll try to get to them. It's the first time that I have a guest on, so I had to figure it out. So bear with me if anything goes wrong. That's because it's the first time. So let's switch to Rhett. Well, Rhett, good morning. Yeah, hello. Great to have you on. First time we're actually talking to each other as well. We've been DMing on Instagram for a while, but now we're actually talking. So, yeah, it did. And yeah, we're gonna talk about our predictions and what's actually true about those in a minute. So we watched the Lumix stream, the Lumix launch together, and yeah, what are your first impressions? You muted? Ah, okay. Let me check real
You'll have
quick.
to translate for me.
Yeah, you were actually muted.
Oh,
So
am I unmuted now?
yeah, you are unmuted.
Hey, there we go. That's the good old live technical difficulties.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
thanks everybody
Thanks,
for who
thanks
said
in
that.
the yeah. Thanks for
Um,
putting it in the chat.
but yeah,
So
so
should be
like we
good
talked
now.
about, there was the two ways they could have gone, which was like a very basic, G9 with phase detect update, or a very like push it as far as we can go with the specs and the functionality as well as adding phase detect. And it seems like they've gone for route B, which I think was probably the smart way to go, since this will be the only phase detect camera for Micro Four Thirds Lumix for a while. So yeah, that was the biggest thing. Was like I saw those two kind of roads, and I think you predicted a little bit more of this like powerhouse, and I predicted maybe they'd be a little bit more reserved with like open gate and things like that. And so I think if anything, you might have been a little bit more on the money than myself.
Yeah, I was thinking. I was actually thinking of the S5 Mark II and the Mark II X, that they are like a proper hybrids, really, with a lot of video features, as well as photo features like for live view composite and things. So I thought it makes sense that they're going to bring that to Micro Four Thirds as well, and give that whole platform a big boost. And so that's why I thought they're gonna also implement like higher frame rates internally in 10-bit. Um, but I was actually, yeah, I believe I said it in your video, like maybe 100, 120p
Mm-hmm.
internally, but I wasn't really expecting it. But yeah, they've put it in 10-bit 420, I believe, same as the GH6. I think it's very impressive.
No, for sure. I think there's really not many oversights or things that I would have changed with this release. In my opinion, I think they are pushing the envelope of Micro Four Thirds. I knew that there was going to be a resolution bump, like that, just from a marketing standpoint. If they put a 20 megapixel sensor or anything like that, it would be seen as going backwards from the GH6. And
Yeah, they would
so,
have. would have disappointed a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, even though it's not the biggest difference in the world from 20 to 25, it's more of like an optics thing, in my opinion. And so I'm glad they did that. And, along with things like removing some of those, we just see that in the comments, removing the record limit from the original G9 and things like that. So it really wasn't just a, G9 with phase detect. They did push all of the specs up as well, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. About that recording limit, I do think, because they were a little bit vague about that limit,
right,
in relation to thermal threshold. So my suspicion is that it's gonna be like one of the few cameras by Panasonic that might overheat in very hot environments. That's what it sounded like to me.
Yeah, and that's because originally I was seeing the EVF and it looked a little larger to me, and I thought maybe they were putting the same fan from the S5 Mark II and S5 Mark II X in that, which I thought would have been the perfect solution. To have a little bit higher resolution EVF for photographers, but also that fan in there. But it looks like the same housing to me, but the vents for the fan aren't there. So
yeah, exactly.
When I saw the body and some of the things, and I was hoping that would be the case, but that was one of my big like 3 issues that I thought might be an issue, was like the no fan. But again, maybe they're not having some of the all intro modes, or maybe, I don't know, maybe it just isn't as big of a deal because of the smaller sensor compared to the S series. But it's hard to say if that lack of a fan is really going to translate to overheating, and at what degrees or Celsius is that going to happen? Because if it's over 100 degrees, then it's like, well, you're still doing better than things like the A6700 or things like that, overheating in like 30 minutes at room temperature. So not to call anybody, I don't know
what.
But
no, I don't know what 100 degrees is in Celsius.
It's probably like in the mid 40s, maybe. I don't know.
Oh yeah, okay.
I know over 40 is hot, hot. So
yeah, over 40 is really hot.
Yeah, we should have had our Celsius
about the
conversion chart up and ready. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah, about the body. Apparently, it's got the same chassis as the S5 Mark II.
Right.
Because the battery grip, the new battery grip, is compatible with the S5 Mark II and Mark II X. So that's interesting. They basically use the same body.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people like harp on Sony for reusing old parts and stuff, but I think it's okay to reuse new parts, because these are all very new technology, new chassis, and new things like that. But when I saw the pictures, I was like, that back is just a S5 II back and a GH6 front, basically, was what it looked like to me, which is not a bad thing by any means. But having that cross compatibility, like if you have an S5 II and a G9 II, having things that work interchangeably in an extremely similar layout, that actually sounds pretty handy to me.
Yeah, definitely. There's one thing though that I was a bit disappointed about in terms of body design, and that is the LCD screen design. I really like the tilt and flip design of the GH6, and it's not on the G9 Mark II.
Right. Yeah.
I find that a bit disappointing, but also it does make sense. The S5 Mark II doesn't have it either. But I would have liked to have seen that.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm sure it was in the interest of size and just distinguishing the S5 to the S1H and the GH6 to the G9II, but as well as of course the size, of course. But I guess with talking about the body design and the camera, I actually had one question for you that was specifically because you used the G9 quite a bit before the GH6, which was, does this feel like a true G9 successor to you? I was just thinking that during the stream because, like, what makes the G9 for you? And do any of these changes, good, bad, neutral, whatever, does it really seem like a G9 successor, or are they just kind of taking that name because of, it's an established series? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think maybe it's not so much a successor to the G9. At least not the like G9 in its original state, because over the years it's gotten like quite a lot of updates and mostly in the on the video side. So it's become much more of a hybrid camera than it originally was. So if you look at like the sort of end stage it's in, the G9, because I don't expect any more firmware updates from this point on, then yeah, I do think it's a successor, but I also think that it's more it's been more Panasonic's idea to make a Micro Four Thirds version of the S5 Mark II. That's to me what it looks like. Well, quite literally, actually, because of the same body, basically. And then, yeah, because of the smaller sensor, it has, some more capabilities, obviously, because it can read out faster and that kind of thing. But I think that's essentially what they've done. They've made a Micro Four Thirds version of the S5 Mark II.
Which, again, not necessarily a bad thing, and I don't think that they need to be beholden to the G9 original when it came out or at the end of its firmware update life cycle or whatever. I just had a thought where I was like, does this really seem like the logical evolution of this? Which I don't think it needs to be. But it was an interesting question to think about, especially because I never used the G9 myself. So, yeah, it definitely seems borrowing from the G9 and the S5 II and the GH6 and being its own thing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, definitely. Let's have a look at the chat, because it's quite busy, busier than I'm used to on my live stream. Really cool that you're here, Geeky Nerdy Techie.
Yeah, that's cool.
Cool to have you on the stream. Let's see. A dream cam. Yeah. Wow. It's certainly impressive. Sound is good. Let me scroll through. Oh, Emily from Micro Four Thirds already did a test in a hot environment. Absolutely no issues, says Uwe. Well, that's great to hear. And Space Lord says, can it record 4K without a crop? I don't believe they mentioned a crop in any of the frame rates or resolutions. Did you hear anything about a crop, Rhett?
I did not. Also, can you still hear me okay? Because I had to switch my audio slightly.
Okay, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. No, I didn't hear, other than the E-stabilization stuff, which obviously crop is expected there.
Yeah.
I didn't hear anything about any crops or anything along those lines. So I would assume that maybe at the like highest 300 a second. Was there?
No, I believe there isn't. Well, I did make a video about the GH6 and the resolutions, and there are like super tiny crops, like in 5.7K, there is a tiny crop, but yeah, with the G9 Mark II, I didn't hear them talk about any crops whatsoever. Also, wouldn't make sense.
Oh, we did see. There is someone in the chat reminding us that, yeah, in the 4x, they're saying that someone said My audio's gone again.
Your audio? Lost audio.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. Oh,
okay,
nope,
it's back.
It's back.
It's back. Okay.
Momentary loss.
Yeah.
We do have someone saying that there is, of course, the crop at 4:3, 60 frames a second, just like the GH6.
Oh yeah, the 4.4K. Yeah.
Which is a shame that was an issue. Not an issue, but just how it was in the GH6 and how it is in the G9 too.
That is, yeah.
I do wish that they were able to get a 60 FPS 4:3 full sensor readout mode, because even though it was 8-bit, the GH5 and GH5 Mark II did have a 4:3 60 frames per second. So that is a bit of a backward slide, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
But it's not 6, so.
Let me see any more. Mechanical shutter. Oh yeah, I didn't hear them talk about mechanical shutter, but Martin says 10 frames a second. Okay, that's not a real bump, because I believe the original G9. Yeah, I don't do stills very often, but I believe it was 9 frames a second mechanical shutter.
Up the mechanical shutter, or are they just going to do some crazy electronic shutter stuff? And it looks like they've mostly focused on the electronic shutter.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
but
that's all they talked about.
I mean, 60 frames. Was it 60 frames continuous autofocus, which is crazy?
Yeah, 60 or 70?
I think it was 75 AFS and 60
Oh yeah, 75
AFC.
AFS, yeah.
I also looked at a few articles and things. Yeah, someone says I think it was 12 frames per second on the G9. I think 12 was AFS and 9 was AFC.
Yeah.
Something like that. So interesting. Yeah. So yeah, do you want to talk about some of the? We'll start positive. What were some of the biggest upgrades we might not have talked about yet? In your opinion?
I think, well, compared to the original G9, there's some obvious things that are a huge upgrade, which is to me, at least in my to my eyes, the USB-C power delivery, which I use all the time, SSD recording, which I regularly use on the GH6. It's basically lots of things that I use on the GH6 that are now also on the G9 Mark II. Pre-installed Vlog. I think that's great. No more paid upgrades. I do wonder if it has a waveform. I can imagine it has. Would make sense if Vlog is pre-installed, but they didn't mention it as far as I know. So that's some really good things, I think. It can even do some ProRes internally, but that's only in 1080p, from what I've heard, to the SD card. And 4K ProRes has to go to an SSD.
Yeah,
but I think that makes sense. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, what other things? I did expect live view composite and handheld high-res mode. So that's there. And I think, yeah, I wish I could have it in my hands and see how it actually works, but I think it's also got DR boost, but the implementation is much better, I suspect, than on the GH6. Because you don't have to toggle it on and off. It's automatic. I think that's great, and I hope they can bring that to the GH6 as well. I talked about it in my long-term review as well.
Yeah, and they've dropped the ISO threshold for DR boost to, it seems like 100 in photo mode and maybe in the standard video modes, and then it's at 500 instead of 2000 for vlog. But, and from what we understand, I think we talked that it just starts at 500 and it's always on. You can't go lower, but you can go up from there. So I also did see somewhere that go over, if you go to like 4K 120 frames where DR boost would be disabled, for example, the ISO does automatically revert back to 250, which implies a very similar vlog gamma curve and dynamic range over 60 frames a second. But yeah, having that at 500 instead of 2000, that was the biggest issue for most people with the DR boost. Was it was hard to work with that high of an ISO in some situations. So I think making it so it's automatic and lowering the values is pretty impressive that they were able to do that. And I think if they could bring some kind of automatic mode, obviously they can't change the sensor to go to 500 instead of 2000 on the GH6, but if they can implement a similar automatic mode where it just kicks on and off when you meet those thresholds, or when you go in and out of certain frame rates, and just have it on as often as possible, that would be really help speed up work with the GH6 as well, for sure. But this isn't a GH6 stream, so we'll get back to the G9.
No, but I do like it. The G9 Mark II is a camera that, like, we start comparing to the original G9, the S5 Mark II, and the GH6. Like it's a sort of an all-in-one camera, I feel like, because it does have a lot of high-end video features.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm seeing in the chat that stuff like waveforms has been confirmed. So
confirmed,
that is cool. And I think that's the direction Panasonic is going. Is every camera can do more or less everything pretty well. So there used to be a lot more specialization with a GH5 and a G9 and a GH5S for like photo, video, or hybrids. And now everything seems to be on some level a hybrid camera, even if it leans one way or another. And I think if they're going to have more frequent but more impactful releases, I think that's a good strategy for Panasonic right now. And then maybe later they can branch back off into like smaller travel cameras or higher end cameras like a future S1H Mark II or whatever they might do in the future.
I'm seeing in the chat, Damien says, any idea if any of the reviewers tested for CMOS streaking? I haven't seen any reviews yet, but it is an entirely new sensor, so it at least won't have the same exact problem as the GH6, or problem, the thing that can occur.
Yeah, I would assume that they address that on some level. If not completely eliminated it, it might just be a thing. But I'm definitely going to be really paying close attention to review footage and seeing if it's up in any high contrast situations.
Yeah.
So I still think it's not a huge deal for me, but obviously if they could reduce or eliminate it, that's something they try to do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I also haven't had many issues with it on the GH6. I've had a handful of times where it appeared. But yeah, I can imagine that some people are really bothered by it, or have it like happen more often. I don't know. Maybe there's also a difference in like batches. Maybe there's a bad batch. I don't know.
Yeah, I've always wanted to get like 5 GH6s and see if there is any real difference. I've got so many conspiracy theories about it too, but maybe that's a future live stream or a future video.
Yeah.
So one thing that I'm curious about is I'm not sure if you've heard much about this sort of detail smoothing effect that can happen on the S5 Mark II. I think it's essentially a byproduct of having to mask out the phase detect sensor points, and some people have reported, and it again, just like the streaking, it bothers some people more than others. Some modes, especially in video, have a little bit of a detail smoothing and a little bit of like a digital sharpening sort of look to them. And I'm very curious to see if anybody notices something similar on the G9 Mark II, or if that's been something that was addressed as well. Because, looking at my S5 II footage, it doesn't bother me too much. But if I really, really look, I can see what people are talking about. So that's one of the issues, besides the fan, that I was thinking could be something I would be looking out for with the footage from the camera.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see if anyone can find that out. One of the reviewers, obviously not me. Panasonic didn't send the G9 Mark II to me yet.
I was gonna say, could be just late in the mail, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah. One other thing I also wanted to talk about, and we can talk more about the G9 Mark II, but before I forget, they also announced a new updated version of the Panasonic Leica 100 to 400, which I'm personally quite excited about for a couple of reasons. One is I hope they have improved the zoom ring, because this zoom ring is like basically useless. Not only for video, but even for photo, because sometimes it's even hard to turn with one hand. But the other thing is that it's going to be compatible with a 2x teleconverter. And I think that's really interesting. That's going to be, I think, very popular for wildlife, especially with the G9 Mark II, with the animal eye detect that they announced. I think that's a really cool release as well. What do you think?
I mean, yeah, I think that was, it's a fantastic lens optically from everything I've seen, but it always did feel like the least premium build quality for a Leica lens. Yeah. With maybe a couple exceptions. I'm not familiar with every single Leica lens that they released. But it did feel like this could be great for video, but compared to something like, I don't know if you've used the 50 to 200.
No, I haven't.
F2.8 to 4.
No.
Those lines with the 100 to 400.
No.
But
and even the focus ring is
a unique lens, so it'll be. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit stiff. Everything's a bit stiff.
Well, so I guess we'll see. I wonder if any of the reviews of the G9 II was able to get their hands on the new lenses as well. And I will say, I was correct that the new 35 or 12 to 35 was an indication that they were updating some of these cameras for phase detect. So my predictions were
definitely
were at least on point for that one.
Yeah, definitely. Let's talk about that. The prediction. I think we covered most of the predictions, didn't we?
I think we did, just by happenstance, even though we didn't go down the line necessarily. But
yeah, exactly.
I do have a few more questions for you if you want to answer them.
Yeah, shoot.
Hopefully they're not too tough. So I think this is probably one question that I think a lot of people are wondering is this just objectively better than the GH6, or does it make the GH6 irrelevant to you, or what do you think about that?
You come up with good questions. I have to give you that. It doesn't make the GH6 irrelevant for me, because of a few things. The LCD screen design is like a big plus for me on the GH6. But apart from that, like apart from the design, it's got like a dedicated timecode input, which I really appreciate, because I do use timecode on my original G9, but I lose the mic input for the timecode. So having that is great, and I think like the image I get out of the G9 is stunning, and I can do basically everything I want with this camera, or what I need to do, and I don't really need good autofocus. So in that sense, the GH6 does everything I want. Maybe except for real-time LUT that we talked about, like maybe you can use that to match other log profiles if you're second shooter or something. But they could potentially add that through firmware. But I do think like the G9 Mark II and the phase detect autofocus, it does have my interest, because even though I shoot manual like 90% of the time, on a gimbal, as a gimbal camera, autofocus can be really useful. But then again, if I say gimbal, it's also got like even more or better stabilization, or an extra stop compared to the GH6. I think we'll have to see how that like turns out in real life, like how it looks. But yeah, gimbal might not be necessary either.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. And, you know, I think if you're looking at, you know, just this pure specs and usability of these two cameras, that's one thing. But it's also hard to discount that, like, the GH6 for $1,300 to $1,600 a lot of times these days, and the G9 II, I believe, we're being talking about like $1,899, so $200 or $300 more expensive, and that's not even counting used copies. And so, just like every camera release, this also might be the best time to finally get a GH6 or get another GH6 if you're someone who doesn't need some of the new functionality of G9 II. So I think if anything, it's just made the GH6 a little bit more accessible for people who aren't quite ready for the G9 II at this point. So yeah, I think the GH6 has obviously still got a few things over the G9 Mark II, and many things are either exactly the same or a little bit different or have a few extra features involved as well, if you don't care about phase detect. If phase detect is your number one thing that you care about, obviously this could be a no-brainer. But yeah, I don't think it makes the GH6 irrelevant either. But that does make me so obviously my next question was, do you want one? So I'm sure if you could snap your fingers and it would appear, you would say yes. But
yeah,
how seriously are you considering one of these for your work, which I believe like maybe some weddings or corporate videos or things along those lines?
I think for weddings it could be incredibly useful. Am I gonna get it like straight away? No budget. But also, like, I don't really need it right now. It's not like I've been looking for a camera for months now. No, that's not the case. I'm happy with what I have. Would I like to have it? Yes, definitely. And if Panasonic wants to send me one, I'm not going to say no. But yeah, I'm not going to get one straight away. I got the GH6 like straight after the launch. And then the prices dropped significantly. So I'm going to at least wait for that. For the G9 Mark II to happen to that camera. But we'll see. Yeah, I would really like to get in my hands and review it as well, because it seems like a really fun camera. But like thinking of business, I don't need it right now. What about you?
So as someone who does have the S5 II, even though I haven't made any videos on it or talked about it, it definitely makes a lot of things a lot easier, just in terms of having a single camera with some phase detect autofocus. So it's a situation where I would have to consider getting rid of probably the S5 II or some other equipment to afford it, because I don't like to just purchase without selling some other things to make up for it, because then you just end up collecting way too much stuff. And so I'm not sure. I'll have to see some reviews and see how much some of these issues, like the streaking, the detail smoothing, how far you can really push the overheating, if it's not an issue at all. Because, you know, occasionally I will be shooting a 4-hour Indian wedding ceremony in, 90 to 100 degree, which, again, sorry for anyone outside the US, but very hot conditions, shooting pretty constantly 4K 60. I know people will say sometimes, like, who really needs continuous 4K 60 when it comes to cameras that do overheat? And it's like, me, because these Indian weddings can be very long days, and very hot in the Midwest in the United States. And so overheating is something that I take very seriously, and I can't really risk it when it comes to things like weddings where there aren't a second take and you can't go back and do it again. And so things like the GH6 with its built-in fan is going to be very hard to replace. And
yeah, it's super reliable.
Maybe there is a place in my kit for this. Yeah, the reliability on Panasonic cameras when it comes to cold, because again, Chicago as well, we get to freezing temperatures, and I do weddings in December pretty regularly, and they like to go outside and get the snow and everything. And so having a camera that can survive in, extremely hot and extremely cold circumstances, and even deal with rain and freezing and things like that, is important to me. So that's just a Panasonic in general thing. But also it's something I'm curious to see how the G9II stacks up in that regard. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Let's have a quick look at the comments. Martin says you can make 75 stills per second. It must be able to do 60 FPS open gate recording, but I suspect they disabled it on purpose to not rival the GH6. Yeah, could be. Does make sense if they can do 75 stills per second. It must be able to do 60 FPS. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is fair, but I wonder what the buffer rate is and how many of those 60 FPS stills you could get, because shooting a second or two of photos, video recording, it is different.
Yeah,
but
it's very different.
I'm not sure how different it really is. So there is probably something to it, but there is the chance that they're being genuine, I'd say.
Yeah, I think this is about thermal threshold. I think like the high burst, still burst, like that's very short. It's a burst. If you go to like 60 FPS full sensor readout continuously, I think that's where it might overheat quite quickly without the fan.
I would still love even an 8-bit version of Open Gate. You know, even if I don't know. I don't know if they could do like a downsampled, just a normal 4K Open Gate, because I understand that full 5.8K 60 frames a second Open Gate might be too intense, but I'm not really sure what the processing power is to actually downsample. But I know a lot of people really would love a Open Gate higher frame rate mode for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Something Philip says, which is also quite interesting. It's not Lumix. Well, it's also Lumix related. He says, personally, I'm more interested in what Blackmagic will release. Could be interesting for L-Mount Alliance or MT, because Blackmagic actually joined the L-Mount Alliance.
Right.
So that's quite interesting. And I'm going to be at IBC in Amsterdam. That's starting this Friday, and the Blackmagic will do an announcement there. So curious what that is. It's obviously not G9 Mark II related, but I wanted to mention it anyway.
Yeah, I think it would be cool to see a follow-up to the 4K pocket camera, maybe even a follow-up to the 6K. I think those cameras are different enough that it would make sense to release both, like a 4K Pro maybe, like they did the 6K Pro, still using MFT, and then switching from their EF mount to L mount would be, I think, really handy for them, just because the biggest drawback for the 6K is always the EF mount, because you're so limited with lens selection. So I think those are both possible, and then they might even just have a completely new system that they're trying to come up with that doesn't follow the archetypes of the 4K or 6K. So yeah, that will be very interesting. I've used the Pocket 4K a few times for some things, and
yeah, definitely. So yeah, that's a little bit of Blackmagic on a Lumix related stream, but it's interesting. So what else do we have about the G9 Mark II? Looking at my notes that I made during the stream. Oh yeah, they brought back pre-burst, which I think is a good thing. Lots of people were asking for that.
Yeah, it's one of those things you don't know you need till you don't have it on the GH6, and I'm like, oh yeah, that was pretty fun to use, even as an amateur photographer, for wildlife and things like that. So,
question is though, is it gonna work for video as well, that you can pre-roll? Because I do use that like in conjunction with my Atomos Ninja V, or the Ninja V can do that. It can pre-roll. Would be great if you can do that like in camera, but that didn't become clear during the Lumix stream.
Yeah, especially with the frame rates getting faster and faster, 120, 240 frames a second, or even normal frame rates. It's easy to miss some of those things, especially like, I don't think it's a big deal, but on the GH6 with its slight recording delay, there has been a handful of moments, especially at weddings, where I miss a moment because turning the camera on and hitting record is a little bit slower, and so I leave the camera on as much as I can now. But having that pre-burst for those things that you can't recreate, or sports or wildlife, if I think if they can implement that for video, that would be really, really handy.
Yeah, it would.
I'm also curious, thinking, I wrote this down in my notes, the Olympus and Panasonic don't necessarily work as well together as you would think for people that pioneered the system together, at least in later years. I am curious if anyone has, in these reviews, has been able to test any Olympus lenses with this new system, because I can see it working pretty well, but not perfectly. But I can also see it just really not working at all and reverting to contrast for Olympus lenses. So that might be something that maybe Emily from Micro Four Nerds tested out, or hopefully someone did, because I'm always curious about, like, when the S5 II came out, like, will the Sigma lenses work as well as the Micro Four Thirds lenses? And the answer was, yeah, pretty much. But with Micro Four Thirds, it's not the same relationship necessarily as Sigma and Panasonic with the L-mount alliance. And so that is one thing I'm curious about, is for those Olympus lens shooters, is this going to be the final push to go to all Panasonic lenses, or is there going to be cross-compatibility to at least some degree?
Yeah, could be. I do believe both Sean and Matt said that the G9 Mark II works with Olympus lenses.
Interesting.
But yeah, they didn't say how well it works, obviously.
I would predict if they work, then perhaps maybe just the zooming and focusing does not work with Olympus lenses, which is how it is with the Sigma lenses. If you're zooming with the Sigma lens, the focus will stop until you finish your zoom. I would assume that something similar happens with Olympus lenses, but it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I also would be curious to see if the phase detect works in every single mode in the G9II. I know some people were not happy that the S5 II in HD 60 FPS, it reverted to phase detect, and I think maybe in some of the higher frame rates as well.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if any of the modes revert to contrast for some reason or the other.
Yeah, I wondered about that too. I did hear them say that in like 240 frames a second in Full HD, there is still autofocus, which I thought was great. But whether that's contrast or phase detect, that they didn't say. But it is cool to have those like super high frame rates with autofocus and audio as well.
Yeah, I think some of the high frame rate updates that have been made in recent Lumix cameras has been some of the most useful stuff for me, because losing audio, I think the only thing that they could improve at this point was allowing you to play back in slow motion if you shot over 30 frames a second, for example, or even at 120 frames a second. But we're really getting down to the nitty gritty stuff. And then we got an interesting comment about adapting lenses and speed boosters working with phase detect, which I don't know. I would have to assume probably not super well, but just because there aren't any official Panasonic adapters like with the S5 II, right? Like the Sigma MC21 or whatever it is like an official L-mount product.
Yeah,
but all the speed boosters I know of are like definitely third party from like Metabones. So I'm not sure about adapted lenses.
No, I think we're gonna have to wait for that, for someone to test it. See how that works.
I wonder if these speed boosters would have firmware updates planned potentially down the line a little bit, maybe to make it work a little bit better.
Could be. That would be great. I believe there's also a question for you.
Oh, is there? Let me look.
Martin, have you already seen on the GH6 when CF card overheats? It takes a while it saves the recording before you can continue recording to the SD card. Don't let it surprise you in the wedding, he says.
I'm not sure if I've seen this. I mean, the CF Express definitely gets pretty hot, but
it does.
I'm not sure if there's like a limit or like a threshold that makes it slower or takes longer. Right, but in most situations, I've seen my CF Express card finishes reading before the SD card does. Um, so I haven't experienced that. Maybe I'm not always shooting in the highest frame rates and resolutions necessarily. So yeah, I haven't
Yeah,
experienced that with the CF Express, but I do know that it gets very hot for
it
sure.
does get hot, and I've recently I had a shoot, an interview where um, the camera was in full sun, and it was like 33 degrees Celsius. Again, sorry for you in the US. I don't know how to convert it, but it's hot or very warm. In full sun, and like no problem at all. Not with the camera, not with the SD card. Um, so yeah, I haven't had that problem.
Yeah, I in Chicago it definitely regularly gets so 33 C is 91 Fahrenheit, by the way.
Mm.
So yeah, I've shot in 98, so that's 36 Celsius and higher temperatures before, and I've never had issues with heat per se. That fan definitely starts whirring. I've shot even briefly in 110 degree Fahrenheit weather, which is, let's do the conversion, 37 degrees Celsius. Oh yeah, 40 Celsius is insane then, now that I think about it.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I've never had a heat problem, but again, I'm shooting relatively modest 4K or even 1080p for certain weddings. So I'm not shooting like 5.8K open gate for hours and hours very
No,
often.
I wasn't either. I was shooting in 4K UHD. So yeah, I guess that also makes a difference.
So yeah, and again, even if the G9II doesn't have that many issues with overheating, I would be surprised. I mean, I think the GH6 is going to be better with overheating, even if it isn't a huge problem on the G9. It's still something that would be in the back of my head, and I would want to know specifically, like some either official or like some tested thresholds of like what you could do. Because I know people said Emily tested it, but you know, she's usually in the UK, which I don't think is super hot, but maybe I'm wrong.
It can get the same as here. Like it's usually a bit cooler there. Like it's not far from where I am. There's a sea in between. But I wanted to say, like, if I would have the G9 Mark II now and the GH6 that I already have, I would pick the GH6 for anything like critical in higher temperatures, because you just know that it's gonna do the job. It's reliable, and like you said, the G9 Mark II would also always be like in the back of my head, thinking like, is it gonna hold up? I think that's where the GH6 shines, really, reliability and robustness.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And, you know, again, if the phase detect is like the biggest thing for you, then that's going to make a lot of sense to go for this camera. Or maybe it's time to even upgrade to full frame. Personally, I think a lot of people could benefit from a full frame camera and a micro four thirds camera if you can afford it.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you have to pick, you still have to choose. And it's good now that the autofocus mode and autofocus type, I mean, isn't the deciding factor there. You don't have to say, well, I want phase detect, so I'm stuck with full frame. I want these other features that micro four thirds might benefit me. Now you can choose specifically on whether you need the best dynamic range and the best low light performance of the full frame, or if you prefer the reliability and the frame rates of the micro four thirds cameras, because that's the biggest diverging point for me is like, do you need 24 to 30 frames a second with no crops? Well, the S series is great, but micro four thirds still has a lot more creative potential for those frame rates and aspect ratios and things like that the full frame cameras don't quite get yet, where there's still the 4K 60 crops and things like that. So
Yeah, that.
I think the inclusion of phase detection makes that choice a little bit simpler because you're not being pigeonholed into one system because of the autofocus system. So I think this is a good step forward for Panasonic and will help people make decisions because I think both cameras have a lot of value to them. And I think based on what you do and what benefits you are looking to get, the S5 IIX versus the G9 II is a really compelling. It's an interesting decision to make for a lot of people. But yeah.
I wanted to add on like the advantages of Micro Four Thirds. Like if you shoot a lot of like fast motion, then like the readout, the faster readout of the GH6 G9 Mark II is a definite advantage for choosing Micro Four Thirds.
Yeah, and rolling shutter, I don't mind many digital artifacts. You know, digital noise to a low level doesn't bother me, things along those lines. But rolling shutter to me is one of the most unappealing of the digital artifacts of like digital cameras compared to global readout sensors, or obviously like film back in the day didn't have any rolling shutter.
Yeah.
And so that jello effect is it is a very cheap feel to me. And so yeah, that's a lot of times why I'll choose the GH6 for more like cinematic short film music video things, because it minimizes some of the digital artifacts that I think are personally are like the most distracting to me. So yeah, the readout speed is a huge benefit for Micro Four Thirds. And again, just like no cropping up to 124K or 240 or 300 in full HD.
Yeah.
And the quality and the noise performance of all those modes being very similar or exactly the same. You know, obviously even in APS-C mode, the S5 II is a larger sensor area than the G9 II or the GH6, but the unexpected crop and having to factor that in, it still matters. And I think when people pretend like, oh, it's not a big deal, it's still a bigger sensor size than and a bigger field of view than the GH6 or the G9 II. Well, yes, but all your lenses aren't designed for that crop factor, and so getting certain field of view or effective millimeters is definitely trickier. And so I just feel a lot less constricted personally with Micro Four Thirds because it does all of the things that I need it to do, and it doesn't have any of those sides or anything. Dark wetting reception or super low light. S5 II or the original S5 is really hard to beat, but in any other situation, I choose Micro Four Thirds personally.
Yeah, me too. I fully agree. And I don't have an S5 Mark II, but it would bother me, like the crop in 4K 60. I would find that very annoying to use, but I would consider getting it, or I have considered getting it, for like really low light stuff. Like there it's useful.
I mean, and
other than
that might be a situation where even the original S5 might benefit you, even with its sort of truncated recording times, which is, I think, the biggest downside of the original S5 is the 4K 10-bit does have limitations. But even that, I mean, that camera's going for very cheap these days, and it's still pretty incredible. So that's also an option for you or anybody else thinking about full frame, is like, is this really going to work for me? Is this really something I would need? Get a used S5 original and maybe adapt some vintage lenses or some EF lenses and see if it's right for you guys out there, because that large sensor, it does have some like notable benefits. Certainly, it's the 35 millimeter full frame is very popular for a reason, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've been going for an hour now. I think we're gonna wrap it up because for me it's dinner time and I'm hungry.
It's almost lunchtime for me, so that also works out pretty good.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining the stream.
Yeah, this was fun.
It was
I'm glad you
was a lot of
invited me,
fun.
and I'm glad it all worked out, even if my technical qualities weren't quite up to streaming. But if we do it again, I'll have my full setup at home. Don't worry.
Yeah, you know, you're on vacation, so I think it's already pretty cool that you wanted to do this in the first place. So you're forgiven for your technical setup.
I appreciate it. Amazing.
All right. Well, other than that, that's a wrap, I think. I'm going to go to the end screen, and thanks for watching, everyone. And I'll hope to see you all next time.
Yeah, let us know if you want us to do this more often. I'd definitely love to come on here pretty more regularly. So this was fun.
Yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, that would be a lot of fun. All right. Bye, everyone.